In our gospel, we see Jesus fasting, going into the desert to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. We might wonder, why is Jesus fasting? I suppose even for ourselves, we can ask the question, why are we fasting during Lent? Jesus, of course, fasting, one reason that he's acting as an example for us, and that is, I guess, one of his primary reasons for coming, to be an example of how human beings are supposed to act and behave. And so as he fasts, therefore, it's an example for us to be fasting. And of course, Lent is a time that we, as a church, take on that type of fasting with Jesus. It also is preparing Jesus for his cross, for all of his sufferings. He is, and that's the same reason why we fast. We are preparing for suffering that will come. In other places in Scriptures, Jesus promises us that suffering will come to us. That's a promise. And so when we take on some fasting, we're voluntarily taking on a little extra suffering, knowing that one day there could be or will be greater suffering. And so we are preparing ourselves, disciplining ourselves, so that when something worse comes along, we'll be sort of already prepared for it. We'll be ready to handle any kind of suffering that comes our way, or at least better prepared. Part of our reason for fasting, even Jesus and then all of us, we could say the other extreme of not fasting is a person who leads a life of much pleasure, a person who leads a life of great excess, taking in too much stuff, food and worldly things. As we sometimes see people who do that, at first glance we might be jealous of their life of pleasure and excess and money and whatever, but after we actually examine that person or reflect on that person's life, oftentimes we realize they're a pretty sad person, or their life ends up rather sad at some point. We could also say, too, after examining that person's life, again, sadly, but a person leading a life of great pleasure and excess, at some point we could also say it's rather just gross, wasting materials and wasting their life in that kind of behavior. And so again, when we do just a little bit of fasting, we're telling ourselves, and perhaps even those around us, that, hey, I don't need all that stuff. Even if it's just cutting back a little bit on some food, it's symbolically saying we're cutting back from all the stuff in the world that we don't really need. And reminding us, too, of the even sinful pleasures. Of course, we shouldn't be doing that at all, but reminds us even, too, if that's in our life, we need to cut that out completely. And so a time to examine what do we really need in our lives and what can we cut out and what can we cut back on. Comes along and as we see Jesus fasting in the gospel, and we can read through the scriptures and Old Testament people fasting and so forth, there's different rules of fasting. Again, even in the Old Testament, rules of fasting, and even today in the church, we have our different rules that the church gives to us, asking us to fast. It's, I guess, good that we have some regulations to help guide us. However, I think we also have to be careful of legalism when we have these rules to fast. And of course, even in the Old Testament, people got caught up on that. We've got these rules, and so people get all caught up analyzing these rules. Sometimes that can be fun, analyzing those rules the church gives us. But ultimately, after the discussion's been had and the debate has been had about the rules, the point where we have to walk away knowing what's the real reason for our fasting. Again, it's so that we're taking on some suffering. Yes, we could ask all types of questions of why and when and what's really meat and all those questions. But that we walk away, the reason being that we're trying to take on a little suffering. It's also, too, as a church, a time of unity, that we all fast together. It's uniting us with all the Catholics around the world as we take on a little bit of fasting this time of Lent, and again uniting ourselves to Jesus as he was fasting in the desert. We also see that Jesus was tempted while he went out into the desert and after his fasting. I suppose, too, we could say, or the fact that Jesus was tempted in every way, it's another example or reminder that he was fully human. The fact that we are tempted, that means we are human beings. If we're wondering if we're human beings or not, that's one way we know we are, yes, human, because we have temptations. I think I've also heard it said before, that's one way to know if you're still alive or not, if you're alive or if you're dead. Sometimes people check for your pulse or your heartbeat or if you're breathing. One way to know spiritually, if we're still alive, there's still temptations that can tempt us. During Lent is a time for all of us to confront our temptations and to confront our sins. Jesus did not sin. He was tempted in every way but did not sin. Sad to say, we as human beings often fall into those temptations and sin. But during Lent is a special time for us to confront those temptations, acknowledge that they are there, address them the best that we can, and try to move away from those temptations. As individuals, as all of us, again, perhaps through our prayers and through a little extra reflection, finding out what is that temptation in our life and how do we get it away from us. As Jesus said in the gospel, "Get away from me, Satan," so that we can address where is Satan in our lives and how can we get him out of there. Of course, as Catholics, we have the great gift of confession, and so another great tradition during Lent is for all of us to go to confession or reconciliation, to confess our sins and then to rejoice in the great mercy that Jesus extends to us in that sacrament. In the bulletin, you'll see there's a bus trip, a pilgrimage. Monsignor Mark Murdian and myself are going on or leading up to Darien, Illinois. And there's some special things from St. Teresa of Lisieux, some of her belongings, and then other things on the grounds there. You can see the bulletin insert to learn more about that and the date and details of that. If you're not able to go on that bus trip during this Lent, I would also encourage, if you can't go on that, or even additionally, to make a little pilgrimage during Lent. Even if it just means coming to the church one extra time, or going to another church, just to make that little visit, a little spiritual trip. Also, too, sometimes even just taking a walk on your own or with a good friend and discussing spiritual things, or taking a little rosary walk, some kind of little journey. That's one of our great traditions or spiritual things that we go somewhere to help deepen our spiritual life, or that journey spiritually with Jesus. Another thing, there's rice bowls at the doors. Encourage you to take one home. In fact, there should be plenty there, so if you want to take a handful of those home with you, and you can share them with your neighbors and friends. If your neighbors aren't home one day, you can go over there and stick that between the doors and see if they ask you about it later. I remember growing up as a kid, during Lent, we always had one of those sitting around the house. I'll admit I don't remember putting much money in there, but I do remember that thing sitting around the house. I knew what it was for, but so walking by it helped remind me of those things. But again, I have to admit I don't remember putting much money in there as a youngster. And then also too, on Palm Sunday or Passion Sunday, you can return those rice bowls, and then we'll collect that money, and the money goes to Catholic Relief Services. Or if you want to send your check directly to them, that's fine too. Lastly, final announcement. Of course, later today at noon is our potluck dinner over at the parish hall, and also there's some music entertainment there. You can read more on it at the doors, and also in the bulletin. Encourage you to come be a part of that. Of course, March 17th is St. Patrick's Day, so we're celebrating a little early. That's Thursday is March 17th. That is our feast day here as people of St. Patrick's. So a special day, St. Patrick's Day, for all of us to celebrate our parish life. So to do something perhaps special to celebrate our special feast day, our special saint, St. Patrick. And as we know, St. Patrick, one of his titles is the Apostle of Ireland, because he brought the Catholic faith to Ireland and made almost the entire country of Ireland Catholic. And of course, even how that influenced the history of our own United States, bringing the Catholic